A passenger mistreated a family pet mid-flight, but when the father stepped in, the entire cabin went silent in shock. A passenger kicked the family dog mid-flight, thinking no one would react. He didn't realize the baby was watching every move, and the father was ready to lock the cabin door and take control instantly. The moment that paw was struck, the entire cabin's balance of power shifted. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the second real authority steps in. Ven growled. Not a bark, not a whimper. A low, deliberate growl, barely audible over the soft hum of the cabin's ventilation, yet sharp enough to freeze Corvin Mallon mid-motion as he buckled his daughter into her seat. The sound didn't waver. It was steady, directed, and unnatural for the dog's otherwise unflappable temperament. Corvin followed his gaze. 2 rows behind, in 7C, a man sat with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He hadn't moved much since boarding. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, trim blazer over a pale green shirt, and eyes like polished slate, fixed forward but lifeless. There was a stillness to him that felt rehearsed, almost studied, and that's where Ven's growl was aimed. Corvin's hand slid automatically to Ven's harness, fingers brushing the smooth patch that read, Certified Support Animal. "Easy, boy," he murmured under his breath. He kept his voice calm, but tension rippled beneath the surface. Beside him, his 16-month-old daughter Lyric tugged affectionately at the dog's ear, babbling softly, unaware of the shift in atmosphere. They were aboard Aerothorn Flight 282 en route to Delmar. It was a crucial trip, not for leisure, not even for the summit itself, but for the research he carried in his briefcase. Years of study on emotional resonance in nonverbal bonding. The data was groundbreaking. And Ven was not just a companion. He was part of the science. Proof. Evidence wrapped in fur and instinct. Corvin had secured special clearance for the dog's presence in the premium cabin for that reason. Every document, every credential was in place. So why was his dog reacting now? The man, Corvin would later learn his name was Harlan Voss, remained motionless, his jaw clenched tight, and his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest. He didn't look toward Corvin, but he didn't need to. Ven didn't growl at shadows, only at intent. The plane filled slowly, passengers shuffling to their seats, overhead bins slamming shut, flight attendants checking belts and smiling hollow smiles. Corvin made a mental note of the exits. Habit. Not paranoia, just preparation. The years of academia hadn't dulled his survival instincts. He'd lost too much to trust in smooth beginnings. Lyric shifted in her seat, letting out a tiny giggle as she pressed her forehead against Ven's. The dog, unusually stiff, didn't respond with his usual tail thump. His ears remained flat, eyes locked on 7C. Corvin gently redirected Lyric's hand, placing a small plush in her lap. She didn't fuss. Cabin announcements echoed overhead. The captain spoke in practiced tones. Estimated flight time, expected weather, reminders about devices. Normal. Entirely normal. Except Ven wouldn't blink. Corvin reclined slightly, just enough to lean closer to his daughter. "Remember what we talked about? Big quiet inside the plane," he whispered. Lyric nodded, copying his shush gesture with a tiny finger to her lips. Then Ven let out a second sound, not a growl this time, but a deep, almost vibrational whine that came from the chest. Corvin had heard it only once before, when a lab assistant had dropped a stainless steel clipboard too close to Lyric's high chair during a trial, and Ven had moved between them like a bolt of muscle. Corvin didn't look back again. He didn't need to. He knew better than to challenge a predator before understanding his territory. Instead, he checked the harness buckles on Ven, resecured Lyric's safety belt, and placed his briefcase under the seat. His movements were fluid but deliberate. His fingers grazed the edge of a slim body cam clipped inside the coat pocket. He had brought it as a precaution in case airline staff challenged Ven's presence, but now he wondered if it would serve another purpose. As the plane began its slow taxi, Corvin exhaled long and slow. He didn't believe in superstition, but intuition, especially a canine's, was evolution's oldest signal. He reached down again, scratched behind Ven's ear, and murmured, "Just keep him in your sight." The dog didn't move. Lyric's eyes began to flutter closed, rocked by the vibration beneath their feet. Corvin reached into his coat and drew out a small felt pouch filled with her favorite teething rings. He let her hold one. She smiled sleepily. And still Ven watched. Corvin cast one final glance at the man in 7C. The stranger now stared at nothing in particular, but his foot tapped slowly. Not nervously, rhythmically, calculated. A beat, a code, a clock? No, that was ridiculous. Corvin shook the thought away, but he couldn't deny the pressure in his chest. He leaned back in his seat and whispered a single line. Not for Lyric, not even for himself, but into the air, where intuition met memory. Sometimes danger smiles before it strikes. The sharp yelp came without warning, high-pitched, animal, and unmistakably pained. Corvin's head snapped toward the source as if yanked by instinct. In one motion, he leaned forward, placing Lyric gently back into her seat and pulling the blanket aside. Ven, their therapy dog, had recoiled beneath the seat, trembling. His eyes were wide, breath quick, ribs quivering. Just beyond the dog's hunched body, Harlan Voss sat back in 7C, coolly adjusting the cuff of his blazer, foot retracting ever so subtly beneath him. His expression remained unreadable, but there was the faintest curl at the corner of his mouth. A smirk. Corvin's jaw clenched. "He kicked him," came a whisper, soft, fragile. Lyric was staring with wide eyes, her tiny fingers still curled around the sippy cup she had dropped. The cup rolled toward the aisle, unnoticed. The moment hovered like glass suspended mid-shatter. Corvin knelt beside Ven, one hand tracing along the dog's side until he found it, a rising knot under the rib cage, tender to the touch. Ven whimpered. It wasn't just a misstep. It had been deliberate, targeted. Corvin turned his head slightly, just enough to glance back at Harlan, who now appeared to be scrolling through his phone with feigned indifference. His thumb moved, but his eyes flicked up, meeting Corvin's only for a second. That was all it took. There was no anger in Corvin's stare, just precision, assessment, decision. He stood slowly, cradling Ven's head for a moment before rising and walking forward toward the front galley, careful not to startle the dog or his daughter. His footsteps were controlled, not rushed, not aggressive, but each one pressed with meaning. Behind the crew partition, Brent Maller leaned against the bulkhead wall, his uniform slightly rumpled, sipping from a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. He looked up lazily when Corvin approached. "I need to report an incident," Corvin said, voice calm but edged. Brent raised an eyebrow. "What kind of incident?" "A man in 7C just kicked my certified therapy dog," Corvin replied. "He's bruised. My daughter saw it." Brent exhaled audibly. "Did anyone else?" "My daughter is a direct witness. I need this logged and escalated." "She's what, 2?" Brent said, setting his coffee down and folding his arms. "That's not exactly credible. Anyone else confirm it?" Corvin's brow tightened, but he held steady. "He did it deliberately." Brent shrugged, unimpressed. "Unless someone else saw it, it's your word against a passenger's. Nothing I can log, sir." Corvin glanced toward the crew access panel mounted on the adjacent wall. A black tablet in a security frame blinked softly, part of the in-flight incident log and monitoring system, standard on Arathorn's newer aircraft. It was likely recording sensor data, location pings, perhaps even micro-camera syncs from the front rows. "Then I need to speak to the captain," Corvin said, voice still neutral. Brent's posture straightened immediately. "Absolutely not. The flight deck is sealed. You don't make that request unless you have crew clearance. Please return to your seat." Corvin didn't move. "Is there anyone else in charge?" Brent leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to a firmer register. "Sir, I'm warning you. You are now bordering on non-compliance. Return to your seat, or I'll escalate this." Corvin said nothing. He turned and walked back without another word, but not before taking one last glance at the wall-mounted panel and noting the manual override switches below it. As he sat down, he eased Lyric's blanket back over her knees. She had begun to whimper softly, still confused, still shaken. Ven had curled beneath the seat again, ears pressed flat, pupils wide. Then Corvin saw it. A flash of silver glinted as Harlan casually adjusted the seat back pocket. Corvin narrowed his eyes. There, wedged deep in the pocket lining, something cylindrical, metallic. A baton? No, thinner, extendable. His heart rate quickened. That wasn't just a petty act of cruelty. That wasn't a man annoyed by a dog. That was someone traveling armed, hidden. Corvin leaned back slightly and stared ahead toward the sealed cockpit door. The lights above it blinked green. Locked, sealed, standard, but only standard, not secured from the cabin side. He exhaled slowly, silently. Not fear, not panic, strategy. They locked me out, he thought. Fine. His eyes drifted to Lyric, now gently holding Ven's paw under the seat, whispering something only he could hear. "I'll lock them in." And then, with a composure that did not match the storm rising beneath his chest, Corvin rested one hand over his jacket, where a small circular badge sat clipped under the inner lining. A microcam. Still live. His face showed nothing, but something inside him had shifted. Something quiet. Something final. Something in Corvin's expression shifted. Something quiet. Something final. Corvin stood up slowly, one arm wrapped protectively around Lyric, the other reaching down to steady Ven. The dog let out a quiet whimper, ears flattened, ribs rising and falling with shallow, rapid breaths. Beneath the thick black fur on his left side, a faint mark had begun to form, reddish, blooming into a bruise. Corvin's jaw tightened as he gently touched the area. Ven winced but didn't pull away. That was all the confirmation he needed. 2 rows back, Harlan Voss scrolled through his phone with an almost exaggerated casualness, legs crossed, one hand resting on his chin. The man didn't glance up. He didn't have to. The smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth said everything. Corvin turned toward the flight attendant station near the galley bulkhead. His voice was even but edged with steel. "He kicked my dog. I need this reported. Now." Brent Maller, the flight attendant from earlier, looked up from his tablet with an expression that walked the line between boredom and irritation. "Did anyone else see it?" he asked, tapping something into the screen without meeting Corvin's eyes. "My daughter," Corvin replied, shifting Lyric on his hip as she clung to his collar. Brent finally looked up, then let out a dismissive chuckle through his nose. "She's a toddler." The dismissal wasn't just audible. It was visible in the way Brent's lips curled, the way he leaned slightly backward as if stepping away from responsibility itself. The implication was clear. No witness, no report. Problem avoided. Corvin's gaze flicked past him to a mounted security tablet fastened into the wall, its screen black but standby light blinking. He knew what it was. Cabin systems diagnostics, internal incident flagging, live log timestamps. It wouldn't show video. Most commercial crafts didn't have cabin-wide surveillance feeds, but it would confirm system interactions, proximity triggers, crew alerts, something. "May I speak to the captain?" Corvin asked calmly, his voice still low. Brent's tone sharpened. "Absolutely not. Return to your seat, or I'll consider this non-compliance." The words didn't sting. Corvin had heard worse in far colder rooms with far higher stakes. He studied Brent's posture, shoulders too tight, hands hovering near the control panel as if prepared to call security back home. Power wasn't being used to protect. It was being used to silence. Corvin turned without another word, walking slowly back down the aisle. Lyric rested her head against his shoulder, her small voice barely above a whisper. "Is Ven okay, Daddy?" He nodded gently but didn't answer. The silence was intentional. He set her back into her seat, secured her belt, then crouched beside Ven. The dog licked his hand weakly, eyes alert but body hunched. Every sound in the cabin, a tray clicking, a cough, made him flinch. That wasn't physical pain. That was fear. Corvin looked up, and that's when he saw it. Harlan shifted in his seat again, angling himself toward the window. As he did, his hand reached toward the seat-back pocket and carefully, deliberately, deposited a slim object into it. Corvin's eyes narrowed. A metallic glint caught the light. The object was about 7 inches in length, but from the way it flexed as it slid inside, Corvin could tell it wasn't solid. It was collapsible, extendable. A metal baton, compact and illegal on board, the kind used by private security, not defensive, but preemptive, for aggression. Corvin didn't move. His breath slowed, then deepened. Not in panic, in calculation. Harlan hadn't just lashed out in a moment of anger. He'd boarded this flight prepared. And that preparation told Corvin something chilling. Ven wasn't the target. He was a test, a warning, or bait. The image of Brent brushing him off, of the captain being sealed behind a reinforced door, of the lack of video oversight, it all began to connect. Harlan's confidence, the casual smirk, the refusal to even look guilty. It wasn't arrogance. It was strategy. The aisle suddenly felt longer, the air more pressurized. Not from turbulence, but from the weight of unseen steps approaching. If this wasn't stopped here, on this flight, in this cabin, something worse might be waiting on the other side. Corvin looked forward toward the cockpit door. Sealed, shielded, standard. "They locked me out," he murmured under his breath, his eyes still on the unmoving flight crew. Brent leaned lazily against the galley wall, sipping from a bottle of water, oblivious to the current rippling beneath his feet. Corvin exhaled once, low and steady. "Fine," he said quietly. Then his gaze hardened. "I'll lock them in." Corvin waited until the cabin lights dimmed. The soft glow of amber overhead panels cast long shadows across the narrow aisles as passengers settled into uneasy sleep. A hum of white noise filled the air. Engines, quiet breathing, the occasional rustle of a blanket. From his seat in row 5A, Corvin watched how Brent Maller, the flight attendant who had dismissed him earlier, now lingered in the rear galley with a fellow crew member, casually sipping something from a paper cup. Watched how Harlan Voss in 7C tapped idly at his phone, pausing only to glance now and then toward the front as if calculating something. But more than anyone, Corvin watched Lyric. She was half asleep now, slumped to one side in her seat, her tiny head leaning against a rolled-up blanket tucked near the window. One small hand clutched the tip of Ven's left ear beneath the makeshift cover they'd built, the dog's dark eyes barely open but alert, breathing steady. Corvin exhaled slowly, fingers curled into his lap. He'd seen enough. The situation wasn't random. It wasn't clumsy neglect or bad service. It was designed. There was a rhythm to the hostility, a timing, and it was only going to escalate. Without a word, Corvin rose. He stepped carefully over Ven, whose eyes tracked him but didn't move. He walked toward the front of the cabin, counting each step to match the natural movement of a passenger headed to stretch their legs. At the forward galley, he glanced sideways, no one in sight. Brent's voice still echoed faintly from the rear, a conversation about crew schedules. Good. The timing was right. He crouched low near the metal service cabinet and reached beneath the lip of a panel behind the food storage door. A slim handle, metal, slightly loose, just as he remembered from his consultations. This panel, labeled discreetly as Auxiliary Power Test Module, wasn't protected by any digital lock. It was meant to be accessed manually in emergencies. On long-haul flights, it was rarely touched unless turbulence was severe. Corvin eased it open. Inside, a tangle of wiring and switches glinted under the faint LED embedded in the panel. His fingers moved with certainty, guided not by instinct but by the countless hours he'd spent researching failsafes and oversight protocols. He slid into the narrow crawl access, meant for maintenance, not for standing men, and gently closed the panel behind him, leaving only a slight crease where the edge didn't fully sit flush. It was dark. The space smelled faintly of ozone and heat-treated plastic. He reached upward and found the intercom control console manual override switch first. He flicked it to standby, disabling its automatic engagement. The next latch was deeper in. A secondary brass toggle with a red outline. Cabin cockpit lock seal override. Normally used only when turbulence locked the cockpit from outside access for safety reasons. Corvin's hand hovered. He thought of Lyric, of Ven's sharp yelp earlier, of Brent's smugness, of Harlan's foot. Then he turned the latch. There was no alarm, no sound, just a mechanical click, low and satisfying. The cockpit was now locked from the outside. Sliding the panel back into place, Corvin rose, his movements careful and measured. The cabin remained quiet, the overhead lights still dimmed, the passengers oblivious. He walked back to his seat and eased down beside Lyric. Her eyes fluttered open slightly, then fixed on his. For a moment, they said nothing. Ven stirred beneath them. "Why'd you close the door, Daddy?" Lyric asked softly, her voice no louder than a breath. Corvin reached over and brushed a wisp of hair from her forehead. He smiled faintly, his expression calm but resolute. "To make sure no one leaves until we tell the truth." At that moment, the lavatory door near row 7 clicked open. Harlan stepped out. His face held the same hollow smugness it always had, but something in his stride had sharpened. His eyes scanned the cabin before pausing again on Ven. The dog stirred under the blanket, his tail flicking once. Harlan didn't smile this time. He simply turned, walking down the aisle like a man who had no intention of resting. His hand brushed the seat backs as he moved, deliberate and slow. Corvin's hand slid into his coat pocket. From inside, he pulled out a small metal badge, unremarkable to the naked eye. But embedded within was a microcamera lens, now active. It blinked once as it locked onto Harlan's retreating frame, recording in high fidelity every detail, every movement, every breath. Corvin's hand slid into his coat, where a microcam badge was now quietly recording everything. As Harlan returned from the lavatory, Ven growled low again, his ears pulling back and his body tensing beside Lyric's tiny feet. The rumble wasn't loud, but it carried a note of warning, deep and ancient. The dog's instincts had already proven right once. Corvin's eyes flicked to the aisle just as Brent Maller, the senior flight attendant, approached with an assertiveness that had previously been masked by faux professionalism. His voice cut through the quiet hum of the cabin fans. "Sir, your animal is clearly unstable," Brent snapped, posture rigid, voice rising just enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "I'm notifying ground response to meet you on landing." Corvin didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply said, "Perfect. Then we can all explain this on record." The calmness of the response threw Brent off for a beat. He tried again, louder this time, latching onto a new accusation. "You've tampered with cabin equipment, too. We have logs." Corvin didn't flinch. "Check them," he said. "Nothing has been tampered with yet." There was something in his voice, measured, deliberate. Not loud, but dense with certainty. Brent paused, his fingers twitching around the handle of the restraint strap on his belt. He had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this wasn't resistance. It was control. And it made Brent uneasy, like he'd wandered into a conversation already lost. Meanwhile, 2 rows behind, Harlan reached under his seat again, his movement partially hidden by the armrest. Corvin caught it from the corner of his eye, his breath steady. Harlan retrieved something, his phone, then let it fall to the floor with an exaggerated motion. It clattered across the carpet with just enough noise to turn heads. He stood up halfway, his voice loud and laced with fake alarm. "That mutt lunged at me," he shouted. "It nearly bit me." A lie, but a loud one. Passengers glanced over, startled. Lyric's head jerked up from her blanket, her tiny face scrunched in confusion. Ven didn't move. He remained pressed beside the toddler, unmoving, watching. Brent reacted immediately. He pulled the restraint band free. "Sir, you and your animal are a threat. Move now." Corvin rose slowly, as if pulled by invisible threads of resolve. His face was unreadable, but his mind was calculating. The cabin lights, dimmed for rest mode, cast Brent in a wash of pale orange, turning his shadow long and uncertain across the aisle. "You move me," Corvin said softly, "and you'll activate the lock sequence on that door and trigger a full mid-flight lockdown. Your choice." For a moment, no one breathed. Brent froze in place, the restraint in his hand half raised. "That's impossible," he said, the words half choked, half defensive. Corvin took a step forward, not aggressive, just present. Entirely present. "Then try me," he said, his gaze locked not on Brent, but on Harlan. "Just try me." The passenger smirked, confident his cruelty would go unnoticed, unaware that every movement, every witness, and every inch of the cabin had already been anticipated by a father who doesn't tolerate harm to his family. If you believe abuse under privilege always folds when strategy meets unstoppable action, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of awareness, heavy and listening. Harlan didn't smirk this time. His eyes narrowed. His hand hovered near his seat-back pocket again. But even he didn't speak. For once, his false outrage had met something harder than resistance. Truth laid bare. Passengers nearby turned toward Brent, waiting to see what he would do. His knuckles had gone white around the restraint handle, but he didn't move. His lips parted, then closed again. The rules were no longer his to bend. And then, in the middle of it all, Lyric's small hand reached out across the seat. Her fingers curled gently around Corvin's own. She looked up at him, her voice no louder than a whisper, but clear, piercing the moment like a ray of light through fog. "I saw it, too." Brent had barely turned his back when Harlan rose from his seat. It happened in one fluid, deceptive motion, too fast for most to process, but not for Corvin. He saw the fake stumble, the shift of weight, the deliberate swing of Harlan's leg. The heel of his polished boot came down hard on Ven's front paw. The impact was sharp and sickening. Ven's yelp pierced through the cabin like a gunshot, high, pained, involuntary. The black shepherd scrambled backward, claws slipping on the flooring, trying to shield the wounded limb. Lyric shrieked, her small hands clutching at Corvin's coat in fear. A ripple of startled murmurs passed through the rows around them as passengers turned, faces contorted with confusion, unsure what had just happened. Corvin rose halfway from his seat, instinct taking hold. His hand shot down to check Ven, who trembled beneath the row, eyes wide, tail tucked. He could feel the pulse racing beneath the dog's fur. Controlled, not panicked, but injured. His other hand steadied Lyric, who now sobbed into the crook of his neck, her breath hiccuping with fear. Before Corvin could speak, Harlan raised his voice, hands theatrically thrown up. "That beast just tried to bite me. It lunged right at my leg." The audacity stunned even Corvin for a second. The lie wasn't just bold, it was strategic. The kind that preemptively rewrote the truth. Brent rushed back, radio still clipped to his vest, and took one look at the tableau. Dog cowering, child crying, Harlan feigning fear. "I warned you," Brent said, tone sharp, almost rehearsed. "That's it, dog's going in the storage deck." He reached behind his belt and drew a long zip tie, the industrial kind used in restraint kits. Its plastic glinted beneath the overhead light. Corvin stepped forward immediately, placing himself squarely between Brent and Ven. "You're not touching him," he said, voice low but firm. His stance was composed, feet braced, back straight, arms slightly out like a barrier. Ven pressed against the back of his ankles. Lyric clung tighter. Brent's voice rose. "Step aside. You're endangering your daughter." Corvin didn't blink. "Then arrest me." The weight of those 3 words dropped like an anchor in the aisle. The surrounding passengers, now fully focused, went silent. The hum of the engines and the faint buzz of overhead lights seemed louder in contrast. Every eye in the cabin was on them. Brent's jaw tightened, but a flicker of hesitation crept into his eyes. He hadn't expected this level of defiance. Not from a man holding a baby, not from someone seated in row 1A with a compliant dog and a soft voice. His training had taught him how to de-escalate irate travelers, how to recognize drunk belligerents or entitled elites. But this quiet, resolute stand didn't fit the script. Corvin saw the conflict playing out behind Brent's expression. He was weighing optics, protocols, consequences. But he wasn't fast enough. The moment was already slipping from his control. A few rows back, a man in 2C leaned forward, whispering something to his neighbor. Another passenger began recording with his phone, the screen angled discreetly but unmistakably active. The air in the cabin had shifted, no longer the domain of airline staff alone. Now it belonged to every silent witness watching it unfold. Brent looked down at the zip tie in his hand, then back at Corvin. "I heard you," Corvin interrupted, voice steady as stone. "But now you need to hear this. That man," he gestured with his chin toward Harlan, who was quietly stepping back to his seat, "has now assaulted my certified therapy dog twice. The first time, I let it go. This time, everyone heard the scream, and if you try to remove him now, you will escalate it to criminal negligence. On record." Brent faltered. His grip on the zip tie loosened. Lyric, still clinging to her father, turned her head slowly. Her eyes, tear-streaked but sharp, settled on Harlan. Then she looked up at Brent. "I saw it, too," she whispered. And that quiet truth, spoken by the smallest voice in the cabin, cut through every falsehood louder than any shout. Because this time, everyone heard him scream. The intercom cracked to life overhead, its sterile tone slicing through the rising murmur of the cabin. "Cabin crew, report flight status," came the captain's voice, firm but edged with suspicion. Brent Maller, still flustered and pale from the last confrontation, moved briskly toward the front. He reached for the manual override latch on the cockpit door, expecting it to respond as always. It didn't. The mechanism clicked once, then stiffened. He yanked again. Nothing. A frown creased his forehead. "What the—" he muttered under his breath, twisting the latch a third time. No release. The door was sealed from the cabin side. At that exact moment, the low hum of the backup media console buzzed to life. Seat-back screens in the first 4 rows lit up in unison, cutting through the ambient chatter and half-lit calm of the dimmed cabin. For a brief second, static. Then, clarity. A wide-angle camera feed came into focus. The frame, Harlan's polished shoes, Ven's black furred paw, and the brutal arc of motion as Harlan's foot drove downward into the dog's side. A sharp yelp followed, painful, unmistakable. The footage slowed, looping again. The image was raw, unfiltered, undeniable. Passengers turned toward the screens, then toward Corvin, then toward Harlan. Confusion became recognition. Murmurs turned into gasps. A man in row 2, tall and gray-bearded, rose from his seat and pointed. We all heard the dog yelp, twice. His voice was calm but resonant, carrying the weight of unimpeachable truth. Brent stood frozen, hands hovering uselessly near the console. This isn't protocol," he stammered. "This is manipulation. Someone's tampered with the feed." But his voice lacked conviction now. Too much had unraveled too fast. Corvin didn't gloat. He didn't even blink. His eyes were locked on Harlan, whose body had tensed not from shame, but from recalibration. Harlan's breathing slowed, eyes narrowing as he scanned the surrounding rows. Not in panic, in calculation. He wasn't embarrassed. He was measuring the room, assessing leverage, distance, angles. It was the kind of stare Corvin had seen before in clinical footage of sociopaths rehearsing plausible deniability. From row 3A, a man in glasses raised his hand, not to speak, but to offer. "I was recording turbulent sounds for my travel blog," he said softly. "My mic picked up the dog's cry. Both of them. The audio is time-stamped." He held out his phone. "Want to verify it?" Corvin turned, taking the device. "May I project it?" The man nodded. Seconds later, the cabin filled with the sounds that had until now only been felt. The muted hum of the engines, the rustle of shifting seats, and then, clear as a bell, the sharp, anguished yelp of Ven echoing twice. Once early in the flight, once just minutes ago. Between them, silence. No aggression from the dog, no raised voices. Just the whimper of pain and the innocence of a moment weaponized. Corvin handed the phone to Brent without a word. Brent looked at the device as if it might explode in his hands. The screen didn't lie. None of it did. He turned slowly to Harlan. "Is there anything you'd like to say in response to this?" Brent asked, his voice now drained of authority, replaced by a cautious neutrality. Harlan said nothing. His gaze slid left, then right, tracing invisible lines between passengers, exits, overhead compartments. He adjusted his watch. A twitch flickered in his jaw. Corvin studied him, noted the posture, the rigidity, the way his fingers kept brushing the armrest, not nervously but rhythmically, as if waiting for a signal. Then it hit him. Harlan wasn't sitting in shame. He was waiting for something. Corvin's breath caught in his throat, his instincts screaming before his mind found words. He looked around slowly, eyes scanning faces, jackets, rows, and then he saw it, a flicker of movement in 6D. A man, silent until now, sat up straighter. His coat, military-styled, thick at the seams, had an unnatural bulge in the lining. Not a weapon shape, but long, rod-like. A stick? A tool? Or worse, something meant to pry. And the way the man glanced at Harlan, quick, casual, but coordinated, was all Corvin needed. Harlan wasn't traveling alone. Corvin leaned in toward the man in 3A, his voice low and urgent. "Can you discreetly stream this to the Arathorn Live Inquiry Board?" The man gave a slight nod, eyes already fixed on his screen. "Already uploading," he replied, fingers flying across his keyboard. Corvin gave a small nod of appreciation, then turned his gaze forward, his focus sharpening. At the front of the aircraft, Brent Maller fumbled at the crew access panel. He had returned with the sole intent of unlocking the cockpit, and now frustration bloomed across his face. He tried the override. Nothing. The screen blinked red. He tapped the command again, same result. Sweat formed just under his collar as he leaned in and mumbled to himself. "Systems glitched. Attempting override." The voice of the captain burst through the intercom, tense and clipped. "Unlock the door. Now." "Trying," Brent muttered, louder this time. "Systems glitched. Attempting override." But it wasn't a glitch. Corvin had anticipated this moment. Earlier, during a routine beverage pass, he had used his body to shield his hand as he activated the emergency redundancy switch nestled discreetly within the manual latch bay. It was a system designed to bypass locks during turbulence, but Corvin, who had advised Arathorn's ethics division on fail-safes just months ago, knew its secondary function. If activated with a second twist at exactly the right time, it would lock the door entirely from the cabin side without raising an alert. And it worked. Now, Brent was left tapping at a dead interface, unaware that the man behind him wasn't just a father or scientist, but someone who understood the rules deeply enough to bend them when justice demanded it. Suddenly, from the rear of the cabin, a quiet rustling cut through the tension. Seat 6, Diad Du. A man rose slowly, tall, thick-jawed, wearing a navy overcoat too heavy for a pressurized cabin. His movements were fluid, deliberate, nothing like the casual stretches of restless passengers. His face bore the same unreadable detachment Harlan had shown earlier. As he stood fully upright, his gaze locked with Harlan's for a split second. A small nod passed between them, casual enough to be ignored, but undeniable to those watching closely. Corvin saw it. Every instinct screamed at him. The man reached into the overhead compartment. Slowly, he pulled down his coat, the fabric folding over a long, rigid outline concealed inside the inner lining. Not a laptop, not a folded cane. Something else, something not allowed. Corvin's breath caught. His heartbeat quickened, but his voice remained steady. He stepped into the aisle. "No one makes it through that door unless the truth gets told," he said, loud enough for both Brent and the man in the rear to hear. "I promise you that." Brent turned halfway toward him, his voice growing louder. "This is your last warning, sir. Step away from crew operations or you will be detained." But Corvin didn't move. His eyes didn't flinch. The cabin, dimmed for overnight flight mode, now felt like a trap of its own design. Shadows danced along the seat backs as the aircraft gently hummed beneath them. Lyric stirred in her seat, clutching Ven's ears. The dog sat alert, head low, watching 6D like prey watches a predator. Corvin's stare cut through Brent like a blade. "No," he said firmly. "It's yours." The flight attendant blinked. For a moment he didn't understand. But Corvin did, because when men like Harlan travel in pairs, it's never a coincidence. The second man moved like a shadow uncoiling, silent but certain in his direction, straight for the cockpit. His steps quickened, a stride practiced and deliberate. Ven's growl cracked through the cabin like the low rumble of a coming storm, alerting everyone within earshot. Corvin's pulse surged. He sensed it before the man even lunged. From the man's coat sleeve, something metallic extended, a compact handle telescoping into a pry rod, its edge designed not for luggage or maintenance, but for force. It wasn't random. It was surgical, targeted. This wasn't someone panicking. This was someone executing a plan. Corvin launched from his seat, instincts and training kicking in. He barreled into the man mid-stride, his shoulders striking just below the rib cage, unbalancing him. The two crashed into the aisle's left row, knocking an armrest sideways and scattering a passenger's water bottle onto the floor. Gasps erupted across the cabin. A baby cried out from row 5. Panic had begun to spread, but Corvin couldn't spare attention for the passengers. Not yet. Ven was already in motion. The dog bolted from beneath Lyric's blanket without hesitation, a streak of black muscle and control. He latched onto the man's left forearm, the one still trying to reach the pry rod. His jaws clamped down, not hard enough to tear but with enough pressure to immobilize. The man shouted, twisting in a failed attempt to throw the dog off, but Ven's grip was unwavering. Controlled, trained, strategic. Passengers screamed now, not in chaos, but confusion. "He's attacking him," one shouted. "No, he stopped him," another corrected. The sounds overlapped into a wave of uncertainty. Harlan, seeing the distraction unfold, slipped from his seat with deceptive ease. He turned toward the rear, stepping into the aisle with one goal: disappear into the confusion. But someone else stood before he could pass. The tall man from row 2. Broad-shouldered, calm-eyed, and silent until now. He rose slowly and stepped into Harlan's path like a steel door. "Where are you going?" he asked, voice low and firm. Harlan froze, eyes darting like a cornered animal. At the front, Brent finally acted, but not with confidence. He pulled a restraint stick from its holster and stepped forward, then hesitated. His eyes moved between Corvin, the dog, the passengers, and the writhing second man pinned to the floor. His face betrayed the truth. He didn't know who the real threat was anymore. Corvin's knee pressed hard into the man's back. His right hand twisted the assailant's wrist, forcing the rod to clatter harmlessly onto the floor. He looked up, voice steady but commanding. "Stand down! He was trying to breach the cockpit." The tone cut through the cabin noise. Even Brent flinched. The captain's voice cracked over the intercom. "Cabin crew, lockdown protocol, now!" But the order was too late. The seal on the cockpit had already been activated manually by Corvin. No one would get in or out until he released it. His own override still held. The cabin was in his hands. The second man groaned beneath him, face turned sideways into the carpet, eyes twitching with barely concealed frustration. Ven remained alert, teeth still clamped around the sleeve, not drawing blood but refusing to release. Brent took another step forward, then stopped. The purser was nowhere in sight. All protocol had evaporated into confusion. Corvin scanned the cabin. Passengers were no longer screaming, they were filming. Phones tilted forward like a forest of quiet witnesses. Some caught Harlan still standing, blocked by Row 2's tall guardian. Others caught Brent frozen with uncertainty, but most captured the undeniable scene at the front. Corvin, one knee down, hand pressed to a criminal's spine, and a black dog holding firm like a sentinel. Corvin spoke not to the man below him, not to Brent, not even to the crew, but to the entire aircraft. "Every camera in this cabin now has the truth," he said, and with that the silence that followed wasn't fear, it was clarity. And now every camera was pointed at the truth. The second man lay restrained on the floor, his wrists bound tightly with emergency cabin ties that bit into his skin. Ven remained by Lyric's side, tail flicking once, then stilling, his posture low but eyes sharp. The cabin had quieted, but it was the kind of silence that vibrated with unspoken questions. Blood stained the intruder's sleeve where Ven's jaws had caught him, but it wasn't gruesome. The bite had been clean, controlled, defensive, just enough to disable, not harm. A calculated warning from a dog trained not for attack, but for protection. Brent Maller stood frozen, hands still half raised from when he'd considered intervening. Now, all the authority had drained from his posture. The purser, a gray-templed man named Alden Varick, stepped into the aisle, his voice clear and commanding. "We're diverting to Halden Field," he announced, tapping into the cockpit relay with an override key. "Federal protocols activated. This aircraft is now under secure deviation." The announcement rippled through the cabin. Some passengers looked relieved, others unnerved. But Corvin didn't react. He reached into his coat, pulled out a secure flash drive, and held it out to Alden. "This contains the wireless relay logs," Corvin said calmly. His voice carried the weight of finality. "Harlan Voss was using a masked transmission app during flight. He attempted to redirect this aircraft's final manifest. He wasn't just flying. He was probing us." Alden took the drive slowly, glancing from Corvin to Brent, whose expression had gone pale. Brent's voice cracked as he asked, "You knew?" Corvin nodded, voice low but certain. "The app he used, Manifest Echo, was flagged 2 months ago by Sabletech's security wing. It was dismissed. No charges were ever filed, but I recognized the data trail." Brent stumbled back a half step, almost tripping over an armrest. "But he's just a passenger. He boarded like everyone else." "No," Corvin replied, eyes narrowing. "He boarded with intent." At the front of the cabin, Harlan Voss sat with his wrists cuffed behind him, flanked by 2 junior crew members who had finally stepped in. He no longer looked smug. His eyes were unreadable, but his jaw twitched, revealing a slow, reluctant awareness that the game had turned. Corvin took a breath, then crouched beside Ven, running his hand gently down the dog's spine. Ven leaned into the contact, steady as always. Lyric leaned over in her seat and whispered something into Ven's ear, something soft, unintelligible to others, but it made the dog's ears twitch and his body settle even more. It was the first time Corvin had seen her smile since the flight began. The purser had already connected to the cockpit and confirmed the diversion route. Halden Field was less than 20 minutes away, a secured, federal-authorized transit hub built for handling covert or emergency deviations. As far as protocol went, they were now locked into one. "Mr. Mallon," Alden said, returning from the cockpit access panel. "The captain confirms your assessment. This feed," he gestured to the seatback monitors still looping the microcam footage, "plus the independent passenger recordings, plus this log," he held up the flash drive. "It's enough for full-scale investigation." Brent finally found his voice again. "You locked the cockpit," he said. "You bypassed security procedures, used an override seal." His tone was accusatory but shaky. Corvin stood slowly, hands open. "Because I knew someone had already bypassed our safety, and I wasn't about to let them test our limits unchecked." Brent hesitated. "You don't work for the airline. How did you even know how to trigger the interlock delay?" "I advise 4 aviation ethics boards," Corvin said plainly, "and I wrote half the manual you ignored." A ripple of quiet laughter, nervous, astonished, passed through a few passengers in the front rows. The weight of Corvin's authority had finally settled over the cabin like a second layer of atmosphere. Alden stepped forward again. "I'll be contacting Halden's airside command to prepare a debrief upon landing. Agents will meet us directly on the tarmac. In the meantime, all passengers are to remain seated." Corvin moved back to his seat, finally allowing himself a small exhale. He reached for Lyric's hand, and she gripped his fingers tightly, her tiny fingers fitting between his as if molded to reassurance. Ven laid his head across both their shoes. From his restrained position, the second man still glared upward, his mouth slightly open as though trying to calculate an excuse. But the footage played again. Harlan's foot, the kick, the second man's attempted breach, and Corvin's voice, steady, calm, never shouting, just threading truth through each escalation. Across the cabin, the man from 3A gave a thumbs up. "Live stream confirmed. It's already in the Arathorn boardroom's review queue." Corvin nodded but said nothing. As the hum of the engines continued, steady and uninterrupted, Brent stood silently near the galley wall trying to reconcile everything he'd ignored. Every warning. Every chance to act. Corvin didn't need to say anything more. His actions had spoken loudest. Ven shifted slightly, tail flicking once more, then going still again. Lyric reached down and pressed her forehead to his. And just before the cabin lights dimmed again, Corvin looked forward toward the sealed cockpit, then down at his daughter's smiling face. And from seat 1A, the father who locked the cabin was now unlocking the truth. The wheels screeched against the tarmac as Arathorn Flight 282 touched down at Halden Field under full emergency protocol. Blue and red strobes danced across the windows, their flashes slicing through the cabin like pulses of judgment. No one cheered, no one clapped. The usual relief that accompanied landing was absent. Everyone sat in silence, some shaken, some confused, all waiting. The forward door hissed open before the seatbelt light even blinked off. 3 federal agents in Navy transit uniforms entered swiftly, their presence commanding immediate compliance. Guns holstered, eyes sharp, jaws locked. Their boots thudded across the aisle with practiced rhythm. Passengers leaned back instinctively. Without speaking, they approached row 7. Harlan Voss didn't struggle. He didn't ask why. He simply stood, adjusted his blazer, and raised his hands with slow, theatrical precision. A thin smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth, but it lacked the venom it once held. His accomplice, still nursing a bite mark beneath the emergency tie around his wrist, followed behind, eyes down. The two were escorted off the plane in complete silence. Row by row, passengers were held back, then methodically debriefed. Agents moved with clipped efficiency, taking quick statements, logging names, checking video submissions. In row 1, Corvin sat still, Lyric sleeping against his chest, Ven curled protectively at their feet. but his eyes tracked everything, each movement, each whisper, each glance from the crew. Brent Maller had tried to retreat. He remained behind the beverage station wall, shoulders hunched, posture shriveled beneath the weight of his earlier confidence. But Corvin stepped into the aisle and intercepted him, voice calm. "You had 3 chances," he said, "to believe the evidence before it escalated." Brent's mouth opened slightly, but the words never came. He averted his gaze, shame scrawled across his expression in lines deeper than exhaustion could explain. A tall federal officer stepped forward, graying at the temples, clipboard in hand. He gestured to Corvin. "We'll need your full statement, sir." Corvin nodded, shifting Lyric gently into her upright carrier harness. She stirred, but didn't wake. As he recited the sequence of events, every phrase was clear, crisp, composed. The officer's brow furrowed deeper with every word. "You accessed the redundancy lock. From the forward panel?" the officer asked, incredulous. "I did," Corvin replied. "It was unsecured." "And you knew how to engage it?" "I write half the ethics manuals your field teams use," he said, tone matter-of-fact, "including this aircraft's de-escalation protocols." The officer blinked. He looked at Corvin again, really looked this time. "You're the advisor from Del Mar University." Corvin gave a small nod. The man straightened. "I read your papers on behavioral calibration. Didn't realize the name matched the face." Corvin didn't smile. He glanced down at Ven, whose ears twitched but remained at rest. Lyric, now awake but calm, reached down and patted the dog's head with tiny fingers. The officer observed her for a moment, as if searching for trauma. "She didn't cry once," he said gently. Corvin's gaze softened. He brushed a strand of her hair behind her ear. "Not after the first scream," he said, "because she knows when the truth is close." A second officer approached, holding a secure tablet. "We pulled the microcam stream and synced it with the 3A passenger's audio. Internal cabin logs match, and we have 2 independent device captures of the second man approaching the cockpit. They didn't just attack, they planned it." The first officer frowned. "Was this a test run?" The second nodded gravely. "Most likely. They were probing cockpit breach response using staged passenger conflict as a smokescreen. The tool he used was a modified pry rod, barely detectable in a standard scan." Another agent strode in, voice lower. "They're both on the list." The officer's head tilted slightly. "Contractor watch list?" "Government Contractor Risk Register," the agent confirmed. "Flagged 6 weeks ago for simulated disruption activity. No arrests until now." The entire cabin seemed to shift in weight. The tension hadn't ended with landing. It was deepening. A realization dawned across the faces of the crew and passengers alike. What they'd all witnessed hadn't just been an in-flight dispute. It had been a potential disaster stopped in motion. "Then Ven's growl was the first warning," the officer muttered. Corvin looked down at the dog again, who now rested quietly, eyes half-lidded, ears still tuned. "He wasn't reacting," Corvin said softly. "He was reading." Reading. The pattern, the tension, the scent of intent. Dogs trained for neurological sync aren't reacting to behavior. They're anticipating it. That's why he growled before anything started, and why he never barked without reason. The officer nodded slowly. "We'll need your consent to submit the footage for review at the Aviation Security Tribunal." "You have it," Corvin said without hesitation. "Just ensure the audio and video remain unedited." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You worried about narrative control?" "I've seen what happens when only part of a story gets told," Corvin replied. His voice didn't rise. It never did, but there was steel in its stead. Brent Maller lingered nearby, visibly shaken as he processed the unfolding consequences. He stepped forward, voice faltering. I didn't know what he was planning. I thought he was just another angry passenger." Corvin turned, his gaze level. You ignored 3 warnings. The dog's behavior, my report, the evidence I tried to hand you. Brent looked away, hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. You don't get to plead ignorance when you chose convenience over vigilance, Corvin added. Before Brent could respond, the officer nearby spoke again. We'll debrief you once more inside, but for what it's worth, Dr. Mallon, I think your actions today stopped something far worse. Corvin nodded, unsentimental. He kneeled to adjust Ven's collar and whispered, We're done here, boy. You did everything right. Lyric leaned over her father's shoulder, small arms wrapping around Ven's neck. He licked her cheek once, then settled again by Corvin's side as they were escorted to the jet bridge for formal debrief. Inside the cabin, the passengers remained seated, silent, contemplative. No one asked when they'd reboard. No one dared question what they had almost become a part of. Because now they knew. The greatest threat on that flight wasn't just the man who kicked the dog, it was what he was there to test. And what they tried to test, he dismantled midair. The apology hit national news before the aircraft's wheels even cooled. In a hastily written statement, Airthorne Airlines acknowledged procedural mishandlings regarding an emotional support animal, but the wording felt vague, insufficient. It wasn't until federal transcripts surfaced days later that the true reckoning began. Aviation Review Board transcripts, leaked first to an ethics watchdog forum, showed Corvin's conduct in chilling detail. The calm responses, the precise language, the lawful use of a non-lethal lockdown measure, and the microcam feed that contradicted every false claim made by Harlan Voss. Across the country, clips from the footage were broadcast on nightly news. One moment in particular went viral. Corvin kneeling beside his injured dog, whispering, "You're not touching him," while shielding both Ven and his daughter with nothing but his own body. Within 72 hours, a new wave of accountability swept through the airline's internal ranks. Brent Maller, the flight attendant who had dismissed Corvin's initial reports and later tried to confiscate the dog, was placed on administrative leave. No press release accompanied the decision. It was done quietly, almost as an afterthought, as though the airline hoped it would go unnoticed. But it didn't. A national panel of aviation security experts convened within a week. Many had never seen a passenger act with such precision under pressure. The footage was reviewed frame by frame. Ven's initial growl, the attempted breach, Corvin's intervention, and the final cabin-wide restraint. What stood out wasn't just the defense, but the discipline. One of the board members, a retired air marshal named Dennett Rowe, stated publicly during the panel's findings, "What we witnessed wasn't just self-control. It was procedural mastery under psychological duress. Corvin Mallon didn't react like a passenger. He reacted like someone who knew how to keep a system from breaking, even when those running it already had." In response, Ven was formally exonerated. The phrase, "no indication of aggression," appeared 5 times in the final report. But more than that, Ven was awarded an honorary commendation as a situational response asset, a title typically reserved for law enforcement animals. A leather tag was mailed to Corvin's home 2 days later. It read, "For duty observed." Corvin, meanwhile, stayed silent. He declined every interview offer, including those from national networks and primetime specials. A lone statement was issued through his university press office, short, direct, and strangely poetic. When systems fail, it takes discipline, not anger. It takes a mind steady enough to lock doors and a heart strong enough to open them afterward. The statement resonated. Online forums lit up with discussion. Hashtags surged. Hashtag locked for justice. Hashtag dog saved the flight. Hashtag 282 protocol. On message boards dedicated to airline staff training, instructors began citing the event during mock drills. One even renamed a response sequence after him, the Corvin Lockdown Directive. Meanwhile, small local papers began circulating a photo of Lyric seated on a courthouse bench beside Ven. A small, laminated badge had been pinned to her coat, reading, Flight 282's youngest witness. The photo, taken without ceremony or pretense, showed the child calmly petting the dog, a look of quiet knowing on her face. But something deeper had begun. Corvin's inbox, once filled with academic papers and conference memos, started receiving letters. Not spam, not media requests. Letters. Real ones. From ethics departments. From aviation compliance boards. From retired pilots who admitted, in clean handwriting, that they wouldn't have known what to do in that situation. Some came typed, others scrawled in pen. But nearly everyone asked the same question. What did you see that we didn't? And Corvin, in his steady hand, gave only one answer. I listened to the one who growled first. Corvin's voice rang clear across the vast, hangar-turned auditorium. Cabin integrity scenario, 282 protocol, he said aloud, the name echoing softly as trainees straightened in their seats. No introductions. No small talk. Just the phrase that had reshaped the conversation around aviation ethics nationwide. The simulation had just ended on screen moments before, a dramatized reconstruction of Aerothorn Flight 282, now integrated into every senior crew training hub across the country. In front of the curved digital wall, Corvin Mallon stood in his charcoal suit, hands steady on the podium. Beside him, Ven lay alert, wearing a sleek harness patch. Situational response certified. At the foot of the stage, 16-month-old Lyric sat in a Navy chair, swinging her feet and clutching a plush toy shaped like Ven. Her eyes never left her father. Corvin didn't read from notes. In the moment, he began, his voice low but resolute. Locking the door felt like a last resort. He paused, letting the silence breathe. The room held its breath with him. It felt like desperation. It felt like something no passenger should ever have to do. But it wasn't panic that made me do it. It was pattern recognition. I saw something no one else did, because I listened to the one who growled first. He looked down briefly at Ven, who blinked once, calm. This simulation you just watched, some will call it a heroic story. Others may say it was lucky, but I don't want you to memorize the actions I took. I want you to understand the moment I chose to take them, not when it was safe, but when it was right. The lights dimmed slightly as archived audio replayed behind him. Lyric's voice from that day, whispering, "He kicked him," then screaming as Ven was stomped. The audio cut cleanly. The sound of a child in pain was not meant to linger. Corvin continued, unwavering. That cabin wasn't sealed to punish anyone. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't ego. It was a firewall, against silence, against manipulation, against systems too slow to catch what instinct already knew. From the far side, a training officer in uniform nodded subtly. Another scribbled notes. You're going to be trained now, Corvin said, stepping down from the podium. Trained to hear beyond words. To assess emotion not as noise, but as signal. To see protest not as disobedience, but as a potential early warning, especially when it comes from those who cannot speak, like a child or a dog. He knelt beside Lyric. She smiled up at him, her grip tightening on the plush Ven. Corvin turned back to the trainees. During that flight, I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I didn't lash out. I held my ground, and I gave the truth just enough space to stand with me. Several trainees leaned forward, absorbed. The next time you face a moment of doubt, Corvin said, rising again, remember that integrity is not passive. It's something you lock in place, so no one escapes accountability. The final slide appeared behind him. A digital plaque with Ven's profile and the words, Therapy Animal, Certified Response Dog, Flight 282. Below it, a seal, Federal Aviation Ethics Training, Verified Simulation Asset. The applause began slowly, then built into a standing ovation. Yet Corvin's expression remained calm, composed, as if he wasn't performing, just relaying what had to be said. But down in the front row, the real moment was unfolding. Lyric hadn't clapped. She hadn't turned to the screens or the lights or the officers who leaned in to praise her father. She simply looked up at him, studying his posture, his breath, the way he stood like the world had not shaken him even once. Because it hadn't. He had walked through turbulence, accusation, and a planned attack, not with force, but with certainty. He had made the cabin safe without a single punch, without rage, without noise. And Lyric had seen every second of it. She hadn't just watched him speak on that stage. She hadn't just watched him lock the cabin door. She'd watched him unlock the future. Seconds later, the father locked the cabin door, the dog safe, and the passenger frozen in disbelief. The baby's eyes witnessed authority in action, and the crew realized they had underestimated the wrong family. If you believe real authority protects the innocent with precision, decisiveness, and fearless resolve, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of power, cruelty, and the courage it takes to protect loved ones. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and integrity in all situations.